when someone builds up their personality, their worldview, their relationships around an illness, what happens, do you think, psychologically when another person like you comes along and proves that recovery is possible?
It threatens their entire sense of who they are, and which is again why I try to be compassionate because I remember what that felt like. There was part of me that resisted it, but there was part of me that just thought this is who I am and this is my identity. And if you say that it's possible to heal, who would I be without this?
Welcome to Truehope Cast, the official podcast of Truehope Canada. My name is Simon Brazier. I am your host, and on this show, we take a deep dive into the real story of mental health, both the psychological and the physiological sides, because lasting change happens when the brain and body are supported together. Today's episode is a powerful one. I am joined by Michelle Reittinger, a bipolar recovery expert, speaker, and advocate whose story challenges everything we have been told about what a bipolar diagnosis means and what's actually possible on the other side of it. Michelle isn't speaking from theory, she is speaking from lived experience. After years of navigating the mental health system, hospitalizations, medications, and the belief that her diagnosis defined her future, Michelle discovered a very different path, one rooted in understanding the brain, restoring nutritional balance, and reclaiming agency over her health. Today, she shares her journey from diagnosis to stability, from surviving to thriving, and from feeling broken to understanding that her brain wasn't defective, it was depleted, overwhelmed, and asking for support. This is a conversation about what bipolar recovery can actually look like, why nutrition and physiology matter in mental health, how hope returns when people are given tools and not labels, and why lifelong illnesses doesn't have to be the end of the story. At Truehope Cast, we believe mental health conversations should be honest, empowering, and grounded in solutions, and this episode delivers that and much more. So whether you are navigating bipolar disorder yourself, supporting somebody you love, or simply searching for a more complete understanding of mental health, this is an episode you will not want to miss. Today's title is When Recovery Threatens Identity While Healing Makes Some People Angry. Enjoy the show. Okay, hi, Michelle. Welcome back to Truehope Cast. How are you? What's going well?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for having me back. I am still feeling tremendous gratitude for your Vice President David taking the time to be interviewed by me 3 times. And our interviews went super long because he is so filled with like good information. And each time we're like, we're only going to do it for an hour. And I think all 3 episodes are like an hour and a half long because we just couldn't, he keeps giving good information and there was no point to stop in it. But I'm constantly referring people to those episodes. I'm like, have you listened to episodes 70, 71, and 72 of my podcast? Like, go listen to those and then come back and talk to me.
Yeah, and they are very good, and I will reference them in the show notes. And there's so much great content out there. Yeah, I went to meet Tony and David at Tony's property in the Kootenays not so long ago, and we were going to record a special 30th anniversary podcast. And just as I was setting up, putting the lights up and the cameras and things, and they're kind of chatting away, and like they're thinking, oh yeah, this could run an hour, and we'll be done, ready for dinner. I had to stay an extra night. We ended up 3 episodes. They were nearly
Yeah.
2 hours each, and it's just the way it goes when there's so much content, there's so much emotion, there's so much story, there's so much questions that pop up when you're hearing and listening to this stuff. It's quite
Mhm.
fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, today you and we're going to be discussing when recovery threatens identity and why healing makes some people pretty angry. But before we jump into that, for people who don't know who you are and what it is that you do, can you maybe give us a little bit of a brief introduction, please?
Certainly. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder back in 1998. It was a month before I was graduating from college. And for the next 12 years, I actively sought psychiatric treatment. I was convinced that I had a chemical imbalance, that it was a lifelong condition, but I was assured that if I just kept taking the medication, that they would find the right combination of medications and I would be able to live a balanced life and be able to live a fulfilling life. And that was not the case. In fact, over the next decade, I progressively got worse and ended up at a point of complete hopelessness. I made multiple attempts on my life. I was hospitalized a number of times. They did electroconvulsive therapy on me, which some people call shock treatment, but I truly had no hope in my life. But I had an experience one day when I was watching my children play. I had a 4-year-old daughter and a 1.5-year-old son, and they were playing. And I had this really clear thought come into my head: if you ever successfully end your life, you will ruin your daughter's life. She'll believe it was her fault and it will ruin her life. And so from that point on, I just became determined to survive. I thought, I didn't think my life had value because I had what I believed was a lifelong incurable condition that medication was not helping. But I knew her life had value. And so I was willing to just suffer for her. But then about a year and a half later was when a friend of mine told me about Truehope. And at that point, I didn't truly understand the difference between medication and micronutrients. And I just thought maybe that might help my incurable condition, you know? And so even for the first few years after I was taking it, I didn't understand the difference between them. I just thought some people use medications, some people use micronutrients. I thought they were kind of the same thing, just working better for one person and the other works better for another. And I didn't understand that I was actually healing. And so over the next decade, I, got micronutrients, got off the medication safely and onto the micronutrients. My brain started to heal. And all of a sudden, all the other things that I had been trying before that weren't working, like working on mindfulness meditation, going to the therapist and actually working on processing and healing trauma, all of those things actually became possible once I got my brain what it needed to function in a healthy way. And then I was going longer and longer and longer periods of time without symptoms. And I thought I had just found a way to manage what, again, I still believed was a lifelong incurable condition. So I started sharing what I was learning on my blog, and then it turned into a podcast and then later a book. But as I went through the research to try and help people more effectively, I started understanding that my brain was actually healing.
Mm.
And that bipolar is not when you get diagnosed with bipolar, you're not being diagnosed with a chemical imbalance. You're not being diagnosed with an underlying condition. All they're doing is observing the symptoms that you have and giving you a label for your symptoms. It's not an explanation, it's an observation.
Right.
And once I started understanding that, then I became much more bold in what I was sharing with people. I started, a coaching program to try and to help coach people through the healing process. I started speaking out much more boldly about, the fact that we've been misled about what we're being diagnosed with. And that was when the hate came. I was actually quite shocked. Like, I was so excited to share this with people. I felt very betrayed when I first started understanding these things. I thought, I went to these people trusting them that they were going to help me, and I felt very betrayed. But then I thought, well, that doesn't do any good to just sit and stew in my anger. And so I thought, well, I just want to tell everybody. And
Yeah.
I was shocked by the pushback and the anger that I got.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that, to be honest. But it's pretty wild. But we're gonna talk about a lot of individuals who, so many people every single day getting diagnosed with psychological disorders, bipolar, depression, anxiety. So there's literally books and books and books on these. And I'd love to just, like, before we step into that conversation, because we've had a conversation about your journey with True Hope, etc., and I'll share that in the show notes. But I want to talk more about the identity that people wrap around their conditions, and if you can step back to when you were younger, when you originally went to see a doctor and a psychiatrist, and you got put on medications. What was your mindset? Do you think your frame of mind as a young person? Because I'm sure looking at it now, it's very obvious that you weren't Effexor deficient, you weren't Prozac deficient, you weren't Zoloft deficient, and then taking these is going to, like, fix you. Like, I feel looking back now, you obviously recognize that, but as a person in, like, your early 20s, whenever you are, a lot of people are very naive to the fact that's the case. So I wonder if you could maybe step back to that mindset, because a lot of people who might listen to this or who are struggling, who do put up their defenses and attack you and attack the natural health industry, are in a position where their mind just can't see what's right in front of them.
Yeah. Well, when I was diagnosed, at the very, very, very beginning, I was told I had a chemical imbalance.
Right.
They said that the chemicals in my brain were out of balance and that the medication was similar to a diabetic being given insulin.
Okay.
And that helped me at the time. Number 1, it relieved me of feeling responsible for what was going on.
Okay.
One of the things that was so hard for me when I was struggling with the symptoms that led to me going to the psychiatrist was I'm a very proactive person. I always have been. And a very goal-driven person. And so I kept buying like self-help books. I remember the day that I went and bought 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. I was trying to fix myself. I was trying
Mhm.
to control these symptoms. I was trying because I didn't recognize them as symptoms or anything. I just thought I don't have enough self-control. And so I spent a lot of time working on that and becoming more and more discouraged and more frustrated and feeling more and more helpless. So when I went to a psychiatrist and I was told this isn't your fault. You have your brain's broken essentially.
Mhm.
Like your brain has a chemical imbalance. It's like having diabetes. That felt good to my brain. It felt relieving to me to be told that it's not your fault.
Yeah.
And it's not that you don't have enough self-discipline. You have a broken brain and we're going to fix it with these medications. And it's interesting over the first decade as I was going through treatment, um I became more and more wrapped up in my identity with this bipolar because I could see the damage I was doing to relationships and it made me feel terrible about myself, but it helped me to feel less terrible because I thought, well, I can't help it. And the psychiatrist would reinforce that.
Yeah.
So my psychiatrist would say things like, your husband and your children just need to understand, we'll help them understand. There was encouragement to do family therapy so they could understand my illness and learn how to support me in my illness. And there was one part of me that felt relieved by that because I thought, okay, this isn't my fault. I'm doing the best I can. I'm taking my medications. I felt like I was doing my part by taking the medications, going to the appointments, and that I just needed compassion and understanding from other people.
Mhm.
But there was a part of my brain that kept thinking, well, it's not my fault, but how is it their fault? Like I could see the damage I was doing and I thought, but okay, but it's not my fault, but it's not my husband's fault and it's absolutely not my children's fault. Like
Mhm.
so there was part of me that resisted that, but there was some relief in this idea that I wasn't responsible for these things. And I would tell people I am bipolar. Like that was my identity. That was who I was is I am bipolar was what I used to say to people all the time. And
Yeah.
it became wrapped up in my identity.
Yeah, I've heard people through the years like, "I am celiac, I am bipolar," these are very, very powerful statements, "I
Mhm.
am." And if that's being, reinforced a million times a day, like over and over in your head, then it certainly becomes a big part of who you are. I I've never had those conversations with a psychiatrist or a doctor when, you're told that you have a chemical imbalance, but then, I'd love to ask, like, why? What's the root cause of that? And go back and back and back, but I don't think there would be any solid answers there. And a lot of that chemical imbalance with mental illness is getting viciously debunked every day these days. So
Yeah.
that's certainly a positive, but it takes a long period of time for that to like trickle through into universities and into curriculum, into social understanding. And especially we're going up against, big money and big pharmaceutical companies that,
Yeah.
obviously I think antidepressants and antipsychotic medications are their kind of like bread and butter every year when it comes to revenue. So there's a lot of challenges, and that's why we're having these conversations. And if we can, support and motivate one person with this conversation, that would be a big positive. But I'd love to talk about the backlash that you receive in regards to, at the end of the day, you're sharing your story, you're sharing your experience. And just like True Hope here, we don't want any other families to go through what the founders have gone through. And you want to, not have any other individuals go through what you went to. And it's all coming from such a great source, from such a great place of light. But you've been pretty open about the backlash that you receive for talking about natural recovery from bipolar disorder. And when you're attacked online, or I don't know, maybe even publicly, what do you think people are actually reacting to beneath the surface of that?
I think there are a number of things. I think number one, um, there's a huge division happening in our societies right now between people that trust the experts. So we've been conditioned to believe that there are certain people who are authorities in certain areas. And that if you don't have those letters behind your name, if you haven't received the stamp from the university saying you are now certified as an expert in this area, that you shouldn't say anything about it,
Mhm.
especially if you're contradicting what the experts are saying, right? And so it's interesting because we're seeing that here in the United States with the Bobby Kennedy, with his pushback against, big pharma and, all of and I don't want to get into things that are going to get people's back up, but that is the issue itself, right? When anybody pushes back against these institutions, they are viewed as other or outside or conspiracy theorists or loonies. Like there's all these things that people immediately dismiss anything that they're saying because these institutions have become mainstays in our society and our trust in them has become implicit.
Mm.
And one of the things that's really fascinating to me, one of the biggest objections that I get recently is people saying how disgusted they are that I'm trying to monetize. I'm out here hawking my book to trying to sell hope to people and trying to sell my book and trying to make money off of people suffering. And I thought, wait a minute, like you are defending a multi-billion dollar industry
Mhm.
without questioning their motives. And here I am with my little $17 book that actually leads people to recovery. The other day I responded to somebody because they were like, shame on you. She went after me pretty hardcore and telling me that it was, she was ashamed of me and how dare I and how do I sleep at night and stuff. And I
Mhm.
thought, hang on a second, you're defending people whose entire livelihood is dependent on people staying sick. People who are dependent on you staying sick.
Yeah.
When I was in treatment, I had a couple of times when I said to my husband, I said, I feel like there's a financial incentive to keep me sick. I was in and out of the hospital, which were extremely expensive experiences, right? And taking tons of psychotropic medications. At one point, I was on 7 different psychotropic drugs. I had to go to therapy all the time. I had regular psychiatric visits. It was very, very, very expensive.
Yeah.
And as I was starting to go through the healing process, I was shedding all of those things. And now, like, I don't go to therapy anymore. I haven't seen a psychiatrist since 2010. I don't take medications. All I take is my supplements. That's it. And that's like eating. That's one of the things somebody's like, well, you have to take supplements for the rest of your life. I said, well, you have to eat for the rest of your life too. You're not going to like balk at buying food, right? And I just know that my brain requires a higher level of micronutrition than what my food can provide. So I give it what it needs. But I don't need any of these other services any longer.
Yeah.
And so, that's one of the things that is so fascinating to me is this suspicion that what I'm offering is monetarily motivated, whereas this multi-billion dollar industry is not financially motivated.
Yeah, it's a terribly weak argument, and something you said there made me think about rationality and clear thinking.
No.
You can't you can't have that argument with rational thought. And I think
Mhm.
for so many people, especially if they have been through traumatic experiences, through COVID, through a diagnosis, through disease, people are scared and they're
Yeah.
going to fight or flight, and they can only access certain parts of their brain.
Yeah.
And I try and compare myself to like when I was 30 and when I was 20, and how I absolutely knew nothing of the world, but I thought I had it all figured out.
Yeah.
Like my brain wasn't fully developed yet. I had not experienced the world enough to really make a full assessment of like what's real, what's not. Even in like little experiences during the day, like am I using my rational brain here, or am I thinking with anxiety and fear?
Yeah.
And so many people, I'm sure, who do listen to your content and have a, let's say, negative, angry reaction, I can only have sympathy and empathy for that, because I'm sure that they've experienced, without question, trauma in their lives,
Mhm. Mhm.
but they're unable to, take that breath, take that pause between listening to what you say and then reacting emotionally. And yeah, I mean, just the idea of your $17 book, and then
Yeah.
the trillions of dollars it's made off people being ill. Like, your disease is incredibly lucrative, especially
Yeah.
like what you just experienced there,
Yes.
and that money's going somewhere. And
Well, there's also the other piece of that fear thing that you're talking about is the symptoms that come from somebody who is struggling with bipolar are very scary. They are.
Mm, yeah.
And a lot of times when I say that it's possible to heal bipolar and that bipolar is not a valid diagnosis, I genuinely believe this bipolar diagnosis. I don't even like talking about bipolar disorder. In fact, in my group, when I coach people through the process, we do not talk about bipolar disorder. We talk about bipolar symptoms because
Mm,
symptoms are information. You can look for the sources of the symptoms and treat the source, right? But a lot of times people interpret that as me saying that bipolar symptoms aren't real. And
right.
that is not true. I
No.
lived with them for years. There's a reason I went to a psychiatrist in the first place. There's a reason that I ended up in the hospital. I understand how scary the symptoms can be. And so a lot of the anger that I get from people, people say, "Well, my medication saved my life." That might be true in the moment, but why do you have to keep taking it for the rest of your life? Like it's I do understand that there are times when these symptoms lead to people being a danger to themselves or others. I do understand that these symptoms can cause us to do very distressing things, but that doesn't mean that you can't treat and heal it. But people are very afraid because there's, like for example, a lot of times people will say to me, my mom had bipolar and you don't understand what you're talking about, and that your language is going to make people go off their medications, and then they're going to blow up their lives, and so what those people are speaking from a place of fear
Yeah.
because they have
100%.
seen the damage that comes from these symptoms, and there's a belief they have, because of that fear, there's a belief you have to have the medication, and that the psychiatric drug companies exploit that fear. They you've got to take your medication. You have to take it or else lives, it saves lives, and safe and effective, and all of this language that's used to
Yeah.
convince us that we need these medications to stay safe.
Yeah, I think a lot of people characterize something like bipolar disorder or anxiety or depression in the same characterization as like a broken leg. Like a broken
Mhm.
leg is like a very, very like objective. You have a broken femur, you have a broken leg. This is the treatment plan. But when it comes to something like bipolar disorder, which is, you're working with a clinical evaluation with obviously a health professional, but it's ticking boxes of symptoms, and it's very subjective at the end
Yeah.
of the day. And a lot of people don't really get that. I don't think. I think it's just, this is a disease that we know of, and you get diagnosed with it, and then there's a treatment plan.
Mhm.
And that's another part of the framework in regards to, I'm sick, I go to a doctor, and this is what I have, and this is what I do. It's just not as clear cut as that. And again, it's that rationale piece. I know incredibly smart people, but and they've had things go wrong with their body, and they go straight to the doctor, which is, fine thing to absolutely do, but to not question anything and to not like look into it a little bit further. Um i- it's just, I understand, because people aren't in that rational frame of mind, because they're scared that this thing might be really, really dangerous to them, and it's a challenging place to be in,
Yeah.
without question. And I wonder that a lot of people probably think that your message is dangerous.
Mhm.
So I wonder, like, how do you respond to the idea that hope, agency, and non-invasive options are somehow more threatening than lifelong dependency and lowered expectations?
Yeah. Well, I always invite I have you can't talk to somebody when they're in an irrational state of mind, and usually when people come after me, they're pretty irrational.
100%. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that as a condescending thing. It's just true. It triggers like a fight or flight, like you mentioned, a fight or flight response in
Yeah.
people, and they get very angry and very defensive. And I used to just block people because I thought I don't need that in my feed. But then I thought, well, wait a minute. I used to be there. I can understand where they are, and I will let somebody stay as long as I think that there's hope for maybe them being open to the message at some point, because a lot of times people are also they're suffering a lot. When people come in and they're like, my medication saved my life if I didn't have my medication. And I always say, I'm so happy that you found something that works for you. I'm happy that you're found something that keeps you healthy and balanced. And I've had people say, well, there's no balance for bipolar. You can just manage. And I always say, are you certain? Because I try to ask questions for people if there's anybody who I feel like might be open to the message, because this is like years of conditioning that lead to this usually. somebody who's in this place of total acceptance of their disorder and total acceptance of this disease model of illness. And this idea that bipolar is lifelong and incurable, our society rewards victim status, unfortunately.
Sure
And
does.
so people start to identify as a victim, and it relieves people of their need for agency and their responsibility for themselves. But at the same time, when you're not personally responsible, you also don't feel very good about yourself. And so there's all of these emotions that are wrapped up in this. And so number one, I actively am working with people on a regular basis that, in my coaching program, and people that I consult with that I'm helping through the healing process. And that keeps me focused on why I'm doing this, because number one, like my story, I tell my story all the time when I'm doing speaking engagements. And so I'm reminding myself of where I came from and how I ended up here, right? I'm actively engaging with the research that is freely out there for anybody who wants to study it themselves. I provide all the research on my website that I use to go through the healing process. From Bonnie Kaplan and Julia Rutledge's book, The Better Brain, my podcast episodes with David on, how micronutrition actually helps the brain, the work from Professor Joanna Moncrief on how the drugs actually affect your brain and that they're not actually healing an underlying disease. All of these things that help me to heal, and that I'm actively using to help other people heal, help me stay focused on what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, so that when people come after me, I don't get flustered or upset or want to sit down and be quiet. But I also try to work with people who I think might actually listen if I'll just be patient with them. I used to get very defensive at the beginning because I thought, why are you attacking me? all I'm sharing is research. Like, you're welcome to go read the research yourself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
But
people don't know your backstory like you do. They don't know your
yeah,
history. They don't know the
yeah.
sensations that you've experienced and the success that you've had. And for a lot of people, that just seems absolutely impossible. And you're absolutely an imposter in the scheme of bipolar disorder. But I think you take an incredibly rationale to those individuals. And I wonder, is there a common theme within those individuals who you do work with, who are open to talking with you further and then jumping into your program? Because
Yeah.
there must be some common themes there.
Unfortunately, usually it's people who've been on medications for a really long time, or people right at the beginning of their diagnosis. So that I don't generally get people like in between.
Okay.
I either get people who've been on medications for years and they're still suffering and they're still not feeling like there's any hope. And that's when they start going to look. And that's how they
Yeah.
find me in the first place, right? So people that have been on medications for a long time. And the reason I say unfortunately is by then there's been some pretty serious damage from the medications. And so
Oh yeah.
the first thing we have to do is actually help their brains heal from the effects of the medication before we can even begin to work on what caused the symptoms in the first place.
Yeah.
The other group of people that come to me are the people who are newly diagnosed or about to be diagnosed. And that's been a new thing recently, where people are hesitant because, and I think a lot of it has to do with the rise in information about the dangers of psychiatric medications. So we've got, people like Dr. Joseph Witt-Doering. We've got, what's happening on the national level with Casey Means and Callie Means. There's a lot of people who are now speaking out actively about the dangers of psychiatric medications. So when people are getting diagnosed with these disorders, they might believe the disorder diagnosis, but they're hesitant about the medication because they're hearing about the dangers of it. And so they go looking, and that's how people find me on that side of it. And so the reason why both of those groups are open to it, the ones who have been on medication for a long time know the medications are not helping.
Yep.
And they're experiencing the actual damage that the medications are doing to their brains and their bodies and their lives. And they want out. They want help healing.
Yep.
And they're desperate at that point. And the people who are newly diagnosed know that they have an issue that they need help with, but they're hesitant about what they're being offered. And so they're looking for other solutions that might provide another way. And I still have to work with both of those groups of people to undo the mindset that they've been diagnosed with a disease, right? There's still this belief in this disease model And so that's one of the things I have to work with them on, is helping them understand the reason you're experiencing these symptoms has not been identified yet. You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that you can hit those people and you've got this new kind of new lease of people coming into looking for alternatives.
yeah,
I think the whole COVID saga has absolutely educated people a little bit more. Just ask a few more questions rather than like jump in straight in. And yeah, you've got people like Casey Means who have so much experience within like the big pharma industry, and they have absolutely nothing to gain from being
yeah,
outspoken about it. If anything, they're putting their lives at risk.
yes,
So for me, they're the people to listen to, not the people on
yeah,
CNN who are like being paid to say certain things. It's
hmm,
those people who are, they put in their lives um, and livelihoods and families on the line every time they go out and do and speak or put out books,
yeah,
etc. So yeah, there's those people who are looking for an alternative, who are asking questions before they kind of jump into a pretty serious protocol, because I think most people don't really want to be on medications or on drugs or being reliant on something like that.
yeah,
And then yeah, you do get those other people at the other end of the scale who are absolutely just like fed up with the life that they have being on all these
yeah,
medications. And we experience that here at True Hope. Most people come to us as their last hope
yeah,
because they've been through so much for so long. They started off on one medication, they end up on maybe 10
yeah,
to deal with the side effects of the other ones. And it's just not the life they want to live anymore. And the body can only handle so much. You're talking about like brain dysfunction, liver dysfunction, kidney dysfunction. They have to deal with this constant barragement of synthetic chemicals coming into the body. And
yeah,
it's such a challenge. And hopefully once we can reach those individuals and some of the people in the middle, then we can go even before that and go talk about talking about
hmm,
prevention of these disorders, because I personally feel, being involved in True Hope for nearly 10 years and speaking with people daily about these products and what they do, and understanding that our soil is so unbelievably nutrient deficient, our food is so nutrient deficient. I don't think that anyone on the planet can eat well enough to get what their body needs on a consistent basis. And then you throw in the stress of living in 2026 and the unknown future that we have. Like, we're all of this underlying stress response going on, which is just continually depleting us. If we're not
yeah,
taking something like Empower Plus every single day, that's proven to work, it's proven to be bioavailable for the brain and through the gut, then you're always going to be in a state of lack. And I think
mhm,
that's kind of like the next phase, is like, listen, you don't have to go through these experiences. You don't have to have the life that your mother did or your father did or your grandfather, whatever. Like, you've got these opportunities, but you also have this responsibility, which for a lot of people, they just like don't want, because I don't know, that's just a type of thing that not everyone really thrives upon or recognizes the actual power of that responsibility and what it can do for you and how it can propel you forward. But I'd love to talk about identity as well, because it's such an important piece for everybody, depending on what you go through. But in your experience, how does a diagnosis sometimes stop being a medical label and start becoming someone's entire identity, their community, their story, and even their purpose going forward?
Well, I think there's a few different pieces to that, and I really believe that social media is driving almost all of it, right? So one of the challenges with social media is it creates echo chambers, and it and we reward the algorithm rewards, like victim status. People go in there, and I did a blog post about this a couple of years ago, about this idea of normalizing, normalizing and bring awareness to, and these campaigns that are self-driven,
Yeah.
like we're doing the psychiatric drug companies work for them with all of this, bringing awareness to the symptoms, and or, getting diagnosed and getting the help you need, and normalizing it and bringing awareness to. And I I understand where all of this is coming from a personal standpoint. I wanted people to understand what I was suffering with, because I didn't feel like I had any control over it. So I wanted people to understand it. I wanted people to have compassion for me. But compassion can become like a drug, right? It can feel very validating to us to have somebody feel sorry for us, and to have
Yep.
somebody understand what you're going through, and that feels good, and it's like a dopamine hit. And if you get it all the time online from all these strangers, it's this weird combination of validation, and that keeps people in this thing like, yes, this is who I am, and people like me for this, and people give me likes online, and they follow me, and they want to listen to my story. And then the things that go viral are the sad things. Like when somebody's suffering, they're talking about their manic episode, they're talking
Yeah.
about the damage they did to their life. Everybody wants to hear about it. So then you want to talk about it more. You want to give more of that, who wants to see a stable bipolar person? Nobody, right? Because it's not interesting, and it's not going to go viral.
Yeah.
And so there's that part of it. You start feeling validated for the worst parts of your life and the worst parts of yourself.
Yeah.
And then there's, especially somebody who's a creator who is teaching people about bipolar, like if they get big, their livelihood is dependent on them being sick.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
now they've got, they need to be validated in this. And then all the people that are following them are saying, yeah, look at this person who, and that's another thing. Sorry, there's like all these different pieces of it that I think play into this like perfect storm to keep people in this mindset, which is that if somebody has more followers, they have more knowledge, they have more, it gives people validity. So
Yeah.
if you have a lot of, if you've got 1 million followers online, you must know more than the person who only has 2,000 followers online, right? And so it creates this really weird situation where, there was a psychiatric nurse practitioner that I came across my feed one day. And she was going on and on about all the research that validates the use of lithium for bipolar disorder. And she was talking about bipolar disorder in these very clinical terms. And I was listening to her thinking she has definitely drunk the Kool-Aid, man. Like she really believes what she's selling. And so I just asked her, I started asking her questions, and I truly didn't expect her to respond to me. I was actually asking questions to try and get people in the feed to think about what she was talking about,
Right.
but she responded to me. And so I was asking her, how do you diagnose somebody? Like what is your criteria? And just, I tried to ask questions to see where she was coming from so I could then ask her more questions to follow up. And she was talking about all these like blood work and all this stuff. And I said, that's not in the DSM. And she's like, well, we don't only use the DSM. And I thought, okay, wait a minute. Are you making up your own criteria now for diagnosing bipolar? Like that's the DSM. That's what the DSM is to define how to diagnose bipolar. And it is solely based on symptoms. You don't go in and get blood work done to diagnose with bipolar. They don't do any kind of brain scans. None of that is used to diagnose this because there is no underlying etiology. So then I was asking her questions about the lithium and the studies that she was saying were done, and into all the effectiveness. And she kept coming back with all of this, like, I call it psychiatric babble. Like it is not there. It sounds very impressive, but when you get underneath it, there is nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally, the last question that I asked her that stopped her from responding to me is, what non-drug interventions have you investigated for treating bipolar? And she wouldn't respond to me anymore after that.
Well, considering she's not an expert on that particular piece of the puzzle,
Well,
why
and
would she?
this idea that, she was talking about, like, her video was talking about the conferences they go to and all these studies that they're doing and all this stuff. And I wanted to know, have you ever studied any other intervention besides drugs? Any other intervention? If you're doing all this research, there's lots and lots of research out there for non-drug interventions. What research have you done on those? And that's when she shut down. And so we have been so thoroughly brainwashed in our society, and it truly is a brainwashing that has occurred. And it started with psychiatrists wanting to be validated as true doctors. And then Robert Whitaker talks about it as an unholy alliance between drug manufacturers and psychiatrists and doctors, right?
Yep.
And it used to be that at least the therapy side of it, psychotherapy, was they were competing with each other. And psychotherapy recognized, like, one of the things Professor Joanna Moncrief talks about is psychotherapists used to not treat people that were on medication because they understood that the drug was suppressing emotional response and people could not process emotions in a healthy way in order to actually heal. So it used to be that psychotherapists wouldn't do it, but now the psychiatric drug companies they are so thoroughly integrated into the entire system that now even therapists will think it's best practice to put people on drugs.
Super interesting. Yeah, I want to
Sorry,
make
that might
sure.
have been a bit of a
No,
tangent, but
no, it was good. You certainly talked about identity, especially with that individual there who's
yeah,
obviously built up this grandioser identity around her expertise. But then once you kind of like poke that a little bit and question, and she didn't have a response, then the classic thing you could do on social media is just to block that person
yeah,
or not respond. And you mentioned at the beginning of that the comfort that comes with the the empathy and sympathy that comes from likes and comments once you kind of put your things out there. And yeah, I'm lucky. I'm 41, so like social media is, it's not a big thing of my it's not a thing at all in my childhood, and
yeah.
I'm blessed for that without question. The only example I can think of is when I've got a cold or a man flu, all I want is my wife's sympathy, and
Yeah.
I might probably cough a little bit worse, and I'll talk a little bit like this, and I'll be really sick because all I want is that comfort and that sympathy because it
Yeah.
makes me feel better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting. But following up on the question of identity, when someone builds up their personality, their worldview, their relationships around an illness, what happens, do you think, psychologically when another person like you comes along and proves that recovery is possible?
It threatens their entire sense of who they are, and which is again why I try to be compassionate because I remember what that felt like. There was part of me that resisted it, but there was part of me that just thought this is who I am and this is my identity. And if you say that it's possible to heal, who would I be without this? This is I think that there's a sense of like, if I can heal, then I have to be responsible, not just for now and moving forward, but for everything behind me. And that was very hard for me when I was healing.
Mhm.
It was very, very painful experience going through and like taking my kids to therapy and telling them like, you're going to have to talk about me there because I know that I did things when you were younger that hurt you.
Yep.
And you're going to have to talk about it. And it was extraordinarily humbling and painful for me to see the damage that I had done to my children and take ownership of it. But it's actually the only way to move forward with any kind of sense of like self in your life, true sense of self and feelings of worth, self-worth and validity. And that's
Mm.
why I work with people in my program so strongly about taking responsibility for yourself because when children are little, if they hurt somebody, we always tell them, even if it was an accident, we say, say sorry. You need to acknowledge that you caused harm, right?
Yep.
And when we are given kind of a get out of jail free card with a bipolar diagnosis, we don't really take ownership for anything that we're doing. When we harm relationships, when we, run the credit card up into the tens of thousands of dollars, when we're, doing things that are illegal, when we're, some people get sexually promiscuous when they're in that, when we do those things, drugs, alcohol, all of the things that people use when they're to cope when they're struggling with these symptoms, if we have that get out of jail free card, like I'm bipolar and I don't have any, control over this, and I'm so sorry, and I'm doing the best I can. I'm taking my medications. You're asking people just to say, like, I don't have to say sorry because I didn't mean to do it, right?
Yeah.
But
That's a
then if you
really
start to
yeah.
take ownership of that, you have to go back and say sorry. And you have to say, I didn't mean to do that, but I am so sorry because I know that what I did hurt you, and I am actively working to try and overcome those, the sources of those symptoms so I don't do those things anymore. It's
Yeah,
really hard.
that's a really interesting way of looking at it without question, what that does for people. And I think even in a negative state of having a disease and having a medical problem, there's actually comfort in the identity of that.
Mhm.
And whether there's people out there like Bruce Lipton, Dr. Joe Dispenza that talk about, if you want to actually make any significant change in your life to be pain free or disease free or have the abundance that you wish, you have to step into a place of the unknown, a place that
Yeah.
is uncomfortable and unfamiliar. And we're just human beings, we're creatures of comfort. And you could probably create a whole lot of ease and comfort in your whole existence if you were to just be completely embedded to the idea that I am bipolar, that this is why who I am, and that's that. Enough said.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I work with people on is we call it choosing your hard. And this is not my idea. This was something I saw, there's a poem that was going around the internet for a while. You can choose to be, work on your marriage. You can choose to be divorced, choose your hard. Like, you can choose to be unhealthy and overweight, or you can choose to do the exercise necessary to get healthy, choose your
Mm.
hard. It's more streamlined than that and more eloquent than that. But that's the idea, right? And and even though there is relief in the idea that you're not responsible and that you are hiding behind this diagnosis, your life is hard. Living with bipolar symptoms and blowing things up all the time is isolating. You burn bridges, you burn relationships up, you lose jobs, you end up on disability. Like, there's a lot of things that this leads to that make your life hard. And there is a comfort in the hard that because it's, like, I know this thing, and I know what it's like, and I know this suffering. And there's, again, like, the identity wrapped up in, like, this sounds really harsh, but it's self-pity. My life is hard, but I can't help it because I'm bipolar. This is just my life, but the hard that leads to the healing leads to a life that is easier eventually. And so that's one of the things that I talk with people about on a regular basis when they're in my program is like, yes, this is hard. It's a lot easier to just fall back into that I am bipolar and fall back into that mindset of I don't have any choice over these or control over this stuff. But
Yeah.
your life is hard as it is right now. Like, your relationships are hard. It's hard. You can't hold a job down, or you can, but it makes it really difficult. Like, there's a lot of difficulty that comes from staying in the illness. And so you can choose, do I want to stay in that, or do I want to lead to, take the path of hard that leads to healing and recovery and eventually an easier life?
Your your recovery, was it easy or was it hard?
No, no. And that's actually one of the reasons why I started, my blog and why I wrote my book and why I do my podcast, because it was so much harder than it needed to be,
Mm.
because I didn't know what I was doing. Like, I was like, I had no idea what I was doing. I definitely didn't know I was healing. I was just desperate because I made a commitment to stay alive for my kids, and I didn't want to keep living like that. I was so unhappy. I was so miserable in my life.
Mm.
And so, I'll tell you, even with cross titration, working, I think Truehope actually calls it cross tapering. I started using that language because that was in the books that I was reading at the time when I was like starting to understand this stuff better. But when I was going through the process of getting off the psychiatric medications that I'd been on for 12 years and trying to help my brain heal, I I think a lot of people will quit that process because of the symptoms they experience, the symptoms of over medication, withdrawal, med releases, all of those things. But for me, it wasn't any worse than it already had been.
Yeah.
And so I just kept doing it because I'm like, well, it's not any worse. And I am having glimpses of better, So I kept going at it and so that's why, like, in my coaching program, that's one of the first things we do is work through that process. And I guide people through how to do that, how to navigate that more successfully so that they don't make a lot of the same mistakes I did,
Mhm.
And so it was a very, very hard thing. But as you go through the healing process, going back to that example of the cross titration, I had one day when I woke up and it felt like it was the first time my brain was fully awake in over a decade.
Wow.
And I called my husband. I was so excited. He thought I was manic because I was so animated on the phone, but I'm like, I'm not manic. I'm wanting to know if this is what normal people's brains feel like. Like, I didn't know how to describe what I was feeling because it's hard to describe a drugged state to somebody who hasn't been drugged, but my brain felt awake, like in a healthy way, in a way that it hadn't been in over a decade. And so those little glimpses of like healing were what kept me going through all of the other stuff that was so hard. When I would experience depression again, or when I would experience a med release or something, I was like, well, I'm going to keep going because maybe I can get back to that, So I don't know if that makes sense, but that was what kept me going through it. And that's why I teach people what I do, because my experience was way harder than it needed to be because I
Yeah,
didn't know what I was doing.
it sounds like your aha moment was wrapped primarily around an external source, your kids, that really
Yes.
kind of gave you that initial like lift off.
Yeah.
And then during the process of cross titration, which is like responsibly and slowly coming off medications while increasing micronutrients with like Empower Plus,
Hmm.
you began to internally feel the difference. And then that was just like an extra rocket booster into the stratosphere in regards to
Yes.
your recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it felt good. It truly felt good to start being responsible for myself. I know that there is like this comfort that comes from not being responsible, but as you start taking accountability for yourself and you actually start to be responsible, you start to feel the value and the benefit that comes from being personally accountable. And that's where our feelings of self-worth and internal feelings, it doesn't need any kind of external validation. It comes from within us, and this recognition, like, I am doing this, I am taking responsibility for myself, I am I am doing these things, and it helps us to feel better about ourselves.
Mhm.
And that internal intrinsic motivation is kept me going through all of these other things. As I started to take responsibility and feel like I could, that was really what kept me, like, really motivated me to keep moving down the path to recovery.
Yeah, the responsibility piece is massive, and I think, especially with our young people, I think that we are disempowering them so much in regards to actually being able to take responsibility and give
Yeah.
them responsibility. I think that ends up being a big challenge. I remember, I mean, I'm not comparing this to what you've gone through, but when you were talking there, I remember getting my first paycheck from McDonald's when I was 15. I was like, this is awesome.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And then you've just got that little bit more of power, and you've got a little taste of, like, what you can actually achieve, what you can do once you put the effort, the work, and the time into it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's I mean, my kids are 4 and 6, so I'm having to think about now, like, how
Yeah.
do I begin to instill in them responsibility and the understanding of money, and that they can think their way to amazing things, and they can use their time and energy to do wonderful things in the future. And it's a little bit of a challenge these days to kind of think about those types of things, but it's certainly available, and it's certainly a wonderful superpower that you can have once you recognize that you can do all these things, and you're primarily responsible for it.
Well, and even our society, like I mentioned before, rewards victim status, but it doesn't feel good to be a victim, because you give up your power when you're a victim. Your all of your power goes outside of yourself. So it
Yeah.
gives other people power to hurt you. It gives other people power to control you, right? When you become a victim, you are, your disease is in charge, or the person who hurt you is in charge, right? But when you take that power back and start to be personally accountable and personally responsible, you you're not dependent on outside sources for validation or for your state of being, right?
Yeah, and it's never gonna get better. It would never
No.
get better in those situations. If anything, it's gonna get worse as your body ages and your
Mhm.
organs become more and more depleted and the symptoms become even worse.
Yeah.
It's wild. I'd love to ask you about, we've probably answered this maybe a little bit, but I wanted to get, like, maybe some key factors, some key points in regards to, like, how your knowledge and experience of Empower Plus and micronutrients has reshaped your understanding of mental illness.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is I don't view, like I mentioned earlier, I don't even like the word or the term bipolar disorder, because it lends validity to this idea that an underlying etiology has been identified.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned before, when I first started taking the True Hope micronutrients, for many, many years after I was on them, I didn't fully understand what they were doing inside my brain. And it was once I started understanding it and understanding the sources of symptoms that lead to a bipolar diagnosis, I can ask somebody. I always tell people, tell me your story. That's the first thing I'll say to somebody when they come to me for help. I'm like, tell me your story. And I don't want to hear your diagnosis. I want to hear about what led up to your diagnosis. Within 5 or 10 minutes, they have mentioned, almost without fail, 3 or 4 underlying sources of symptoms. And one of the primary sources of symptoms for almost everybody out there is micronutrient insufficiency. And I'm going to put a plug in for these podcast episodes with David on my podcast too, because I even learned more. Like I've been studying this stuff for the past, 3 years, and I learned way more even just talking to David about those building blocks for the neurotransmitters in our brains. And if you want to talk about chemicals, there are chemicals in our brain. They're not the synthetic chemicals that are produced in drugs.
Yeah.
They are naturally occurring chemicals that are the neurotransmitters that regulate our emotions. And one of the big arguments that people will come to me with is, yeah, you might be able to resolve something as minor as depression, but you can't resolve psychosis. And I'm like, psychosis and depression are just opposite ends of the same scale. Like all you're doing is your brain is not getting what it needs to regulate itself. It is not getting the micronutrients necessary to regulate the emotional response. And so I loved what David talked about, how there are 4 key building blocks to the neurotransmitters. You've got vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and omega-3s. The omegas that our brains need. And if you are getting insufficient levels of any of those, your brain is not getting what it needs to function in a healthy way. It is not building the neurotransmitters in a way that your brain is getting what it needs to function in a healthy way. And we have no problem understanding that if you completely eliminate macronutrients from your diet, like if you completely eliminate fat from your diet, for example, you're going to get sick. Your body needs those macronutrients to function, to, rebuild cells and to regenerate your muscles and, protein. Eliminate all your protein from your diet and you're going to get super sick and your muscles are going to atrophy. Yep. And we understand that, but we don't think about the correlation between that and the brain. If our brain is not getting what it needs to function in a healthy way, it will become distressed. You'll end up with symptoms that indicate the brain is in distress. And that leads us, instead of asking people, when a psychiatrist interviews somebody at the beginning, they should be taking a history of, do you have a history of trauma in your life? Is there any history of substance use? Have you been using any medications that could be causing an adverse reaction in your brain? What's going on with your nutrient intake? Is your brain getting what it needs to function in a healthy way? And I've been super fascinated by the work of Julia Ruckledge in doing these studies in high stress situations, like, the Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake, and, going into places where there are natural disasters where you can see the outside stressor. There's major outside stress occurring. Number one, because of the disaster. And so you're under a lot of stress, right? And then people in those situations are not getting enough to eat. They're not getting healthy food, right? So you've got this like perfect storm to test this theory out. And every time they go in and do these studies, the people who are given the micronutrients fare statistically significantly better than the people who aren't, because their brains are getting what they need to be able to handle the stress they're under. And so that's the thing that is like, it is so logical to me. And a lot of times people will come after me and say, like, what's your degree? And I've gotten a little snarky lately with it, because I'm so sick of being so, what's your degree? And you're not a doctor. You shouldn't be talking about this. And I'm like, I have common sense and the ability to read research and apply it. That's my credential. Like you can do the same thing. You can use your common sense. You can learn about how these things affect your brain and your ability to function, and what the symptoms that can result are if your brain is not getting what it needs to function in a healthy way. And then you can put 2 and 2 together.
Yeah, I speak to a lot of people in natural health stores, so they're kind of a little bit more attuned to the natural order of things, but most people aren't really like that. So, yeah, when I explain nutritional deficiency to people, I explain that, if you're not consuming and absorbing and assimilating the building blocks of what it is to be a human being, which is essentially proteins, you're not going to be able to make things like melatonin, serotonin, all these very, very vital hormones and neurotransmitters. And there's obviously thousands and thousands of them. Those are just kind of really popular ones. Mm-hmm. But then you go a little layer deeper, because you need to be able to convert things like tryptophan, an amino acid. You need to be able to convert that into serotonin and then into melatonin. It doesn't happen like with air. Like you need cofactors, you need minerals, individual minerals, you need amino acids, you need vitamins to do all of these like phenomenal, incredible things. And if you are deficient somewhat in any of these, you're going to be in a state of lack. It doesn't mean you're not going to make any melatonin or serotonin, but your ability to do that on a consistent basis. And if you're in a stressful environment or in a stressed state, in a stressed part of your life, your ability to do that again just becomes even trickier. Yeah. And in my experience, I practiced. I moved to this part of the world to study nutrition and learn about the pharmacology and learn about the micronutrients and the nutrition and even the like Ayurvedic and Chinese medicine side of healing. And for me, my understanding on mental health is like you've kind of got this like spectrum of mental health, and there's like serious psychological disorders. I put bipolar, schizophrenia in those things as well. And then I feel like I'm over here where I just, I've got young kids and I live in 2026, and I'm just, I experience stress.
Yeah.
And you need consistent micronutrients on a daily basis. And some people, these people over here, without question, need them more than other people, because we're just all very different.
Yeah.
And if you're not taking care of that, and you're not consuming a well-researched, well put together, produced, manufactured product, you will be in a state of lack. And that's just the way it is. And I think that if we had the powers that be, and we had a different way of dealing with nutrition and health, then anyone who went into a doctor's office feeling anxious or feeling depressed or feeling suicidal, the first point of call would be nutrition. It would be, what do you consume on a daily basis? And doctors have 7, 8, 9 minutes if you're lucky to have that conversation. So you're not going to be able to dive into a 2-hour nutritional consult, which is ideally way more valuable, where you can actually look into these things. I get anxious when I don't drink enough water. Like
Yeah.
I don't have an anxiety disorder. I'm just like lazy, and I've just not drunk enough water that day. And that can be, it's almost like the answer is too, I'm not going to swear, too simple to be the reality. Like we have to overcomplicate these things. And again, we need these comforts. We need these clear understanding. Oh, I am bipolar. Oh, that's the way it is. So that's simple. It couldn't be as easy as like, maybe I need to consume micronutrient supplementations, and maybe my food and my soil has been absolutely destroyed over the past 100 years. Maybe that's not a factor.
Yeah.
Like it just makes way more sense. And I think as you get older and you get more experience and you get more rational, these things just make way more sense when you like really look around the world and you see what's happening. Like at the end of the day, like we've never been more psychologically ill, and we've never had more drugs available for that. Are we getting better? Like,
Right.
no.
Yeah. Well, and I will tell you one other thing that I struggled with was when you're struggling with mood swings like I experienced, it creates a problem for self-discipline. So I would be super self-disciplined when I was in my upswing, but then I would crash and I would struggle just to get out of bed in the morning. And so it created a problem for me with self-discipline, which meant I wasn't progressing in my life in a lot of ways. And the bipolar diagnosis can make you feel special. It can make you feel unique. It can make you feel like there's something different about you. And so, so there's, and then there's also along with that, there are people who are, are artists or musicians and they get a lot of their inspiration when they're in their manic phase and they don't want to lose that. So there's a lot of times when people get kind of dependent or wrapped up in the diagnosis, in the symptoms that make you afraid of like, who would I be if I didn't have this? Right. So there's so many different ways that people that this challenges people's sense of being, that it makes them feel very defensive and angry. And, if they're presented with the possibility that what they've been told is not true about what they're struggling with, that it's possible that they don't have to live with that for the rest of their life. And since I brought this up, I will tell you, I am way more creative and way more like able to grow into myself and develop my talents now that I'm stable than I ever was when I was struggling with the symptoms, ever. Like there's not even a contest of the difference,
The idea or the fact there that you just mentioned about people wanting to feel special and super is without question, I think, a big core root of it. I think I remember like so many people when they're young, they want to be famous.
Yeah.
They want to stand out. They want to be seen. They want to be relative. And that is a huge, big part of an identity wrapped around a disorder. I think you nailed it there. We've just hit the hour here, but for someone listening who does feel trapped in their diagnosis and maybe even afraid of letting go of it, what would you say to them about who they are without the illness defining them?
I am constantly in awe of the people that come to me and what they have to offer the world that has been trapped inside of them because of the struggles that they have with their symptoms. I get so excited as I help people go through the healing process and help them to really truly see who they are without the illness and who they have the potential to become and what they have to offer the world. It is actually quite an honor. And I have not experienced a single person who that's not true for. And so I think that there is an underlying fear of who would I be without this, but I want to challenge that because I think you have so much to offer the world that is being prevented by these symptoms and by this illness that you're struggling with. And if you have the courage to move into healing and choose the hard that leads to recovery, you have the opportunity to discover yourself in a way that you never realized you could be. Everybody, I truly believe that. I truly believe that this becomes a trap for people that prevents them from fulfilling themselves and from becoming the person that they have the capability to become and offering the world their unique talents and gifts that nobody else has.
Yeah, beautifully said. And if I was going to put my conspiratorial hat on for a second, it wouldn't probably be a good idea if we had most of the population feeling inspired,
Yes.
creative, motivated, and fully functional. I
Yeah,
think that large populations are way easier to control if they are struggling and dependent on a system that doesn't really serve them.
absolutely.
Anyway, final thing here. If the haters were actually listening to, listen to us right now, and not to argue, but to primarily like understand, because I also think that those people who are like real haters, let's just say you're hardcore non-fans, they're not going to listen to an hour conversation of you and me. They're going to listen to the clips and they're going to comment to the clips because that's just kind of who we are as human beings. I
Yeah.
sometimes fall into that trap when I hear insane far left wing politics. But I'm trying to do my best. I'm trying to learn. But what do you think those individuals might realize about themselves, their fears, and their stories that they have been told about bipolar disorder?
I really truly hope that people will start to listen with an open mind. When a lot of times when people come after me, I always ask, have you looked at any of the information that I offer? Have you looked at, read my story?
Mm,
I do know the suffering you're experiencing. I went through that myself. Read my story. You'll hear about the suffering that I experienced and that I actively sought psychiatric treatment through the traditional psychiatric system for over a decade. I know what it feels like to suffer that way, and I know how hard it is to confront the possibility that maybe you do have the ability to heal, and then you have to look back and say sorry for the things that you did when you were struggling with the symptoms. But think about how hard your life is already. How you have to constantly be asking people to make excuses for you or to be okay with the choices that you're making when you're struggling with symptoms. It doesn't feel good to be on these medications. Our brains never feel right on them. They never feel right on them because they are not normalizing our brain, they're abnormalizing it. Just be open. Just be willing to listen a little bit. Check out my podcast, check out the True Hope podcast, learn about what we're talking about, and then talk to other people who've gone through the healing process themselves and ask them if they regret it. I certainly don't. My life is so much better now. Like I never could have fathomed that my life could be the way that it is now. I never could have fathomed that I could go through challenging situations in my life and not end up in the hospital as a result. But now I can. I can navigate life and normal emotional responses with capability and stay stable and support other people while they're struggling. And I never could have done that if I had stayed stuck in the psychiatric illness that I was diagnosed with and the treatment that was not helping me to get better.
well said. And I think a great segue into, let's just say, our world is watching Epiphany, the True Hope Battle, which
Absolutely.
is the latest documentary about our company and about our story and about our history. I'll leave a link for that in the show notes. It's free to watch on our website. And just in closing, I feel that a lot of the, let's say, happiness or dopamine hit that a lot of these like individuals get is in this echo chamber of social media. of these comments and likes or whatever it might be, you can obtain that just by waking up in the morning and looking at a blue sky. Like that could be your normal 24 hours or 16 hours of your waking day, experiencing and being able to create that natural, normal neurochemistry and not being reliant on a screen and scrolling in a dark place to try and hit that brain chemistry. I understand and I sympathize because, you're in a struggling world with screens and technology. They're addicting. They do create happy hormones, but you got to know that it's not a long-term solution, and there are amazing people out there who are just ready and happy to support you. And that, yeah, it comes from a real great place of joy, happiness, and grace.
Yeah.
Yes, wonderful. Michelle, where can people connect with you and learn more?
The upside of bipolar.com is my website, and everything is linked there. My book, my podcast, there's my social media is all linked there. So the upside of bipolar.com is the best place to start.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Again, it's always an absolute pleasure. Yeah, I'll make sure that the show notes is probably going to be flooded with links and information, but that's all good. There's so much great stuff to share, and I hope people do take that time to be able to dive a little bit deeper. But yeah, that is it for this week. We'll see everyone soon. Thanks so much, Michelle.
Thank you.